Hi, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Show. We're going to talk today about something that we almost never talk about. I don't think I've ever had a conversation about it on this show, and that's because it's not widely considered important. But I think over the past several weeks in particular, the issue of Africa, the continent, what's happening there, has come up in some pretty profound ways here in Israel. Just in the last week alone, we had a major blow-up. First, the happy news that Foreign Minister Eli Cohen was meeting with his Libyan counterpart in Rome, and then after the news came out, she was suddenly on the lam running away to Turkey, and the whole government may fall, and people were killed in Tripoli as a result of the news that she had met with Minister Cohen. So then there was all of that. And then on Saturday, we had Eritrean migrants rioting in a way that we've never seen before in the streets of Tel Aviv, attacking police with crowbars and rocks, and apparently some of them were armed with guns. And we've never seen that, and it certainly looked like we were in Eritrea, not in Tel Aviv, where this was happening. So just those two issues make me kind of feel like, gee, this is something we have to look into. And the best person to talk to is Ambassador J. Peter Pham. He is presently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and senior advisor to the Kach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. And he's the former U.S. Special Envoy for West Africa and the Great Lakes region of Africa, which sort of encompasses all of these areas. And he's also come highly recommended to me by very close friends in Washington, including, by the way, my sister. And so it's my pleasure that I was finally able to reach Ambassador Pham and have him on the program. So first of all, without any further ado, welcome Ambassador Pham to the Carolyn Glick Show.
Carolyn, it's a pleasure to be with you.
All right. So can you just let's start a little bit with why should we care about Africa, other than the obvious that I just mentioned, which is that it keeps seeming to bite us in the back. So tell us a little bit about Africa and why it's so important for us to be a little bit more focused on it.
Well, I would make the argument, and not just because I follow Africa closely as a matter of professional and personal interest, but because I truly believe Africa is the continent that will strategically break us in the 21st century. And why do I say that? Just let me throw out some data points. By mid-century, which we're not that far off from, by mid-century, 1 in 4 workers in the world is going to be African. That's an incredible demographic number. 1 in 4, as the West, Europe, America, and even the Far East, this is where the workforce is going to be. And that can either be a very productive force, or it could be a lot of frustrated people on the edges of Israel and Europe and beyond. Secondly, strategic minerals. Think about some of the transition minerals we're all talking about as we make that energy transition. Cobalt, rare earths, all those are found in abundance in Africa. If you think just one country in Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was my as U.S. Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region, just that one country produces 2/3 of the world's cobalt. And without cobalt, electric cars, none of that's happening. So again, another strategic reason, we're down the list of minerals. And then at international settings, the United Nations and other fora, where the issues of the world, including those of Israel and its neighbors in the Middle East, are debated. The large block of is African. 54 states that are members of the African Union. And of course, we can discuss, in recent years, there's been the issue of Israel's representation or observer status at the African Union. It's geography, it's demographics, it's geology. Africa is important, and as you highlighted, we don't pay as much strategic attention to it as we ought, and I think that's a mistake.
So I think that from a strategic perspective, one of the real pioneers, and we had Golda Meir in the 1960s in Africa, Shamir paid some attention to them after the Cold War when they started reopening diplomatic relations, which they cut off after the Yom Kippur War. And then really it was Benjamin Netanyahu in his previous stint as prime minister who really placed an emphasis on developing and deepening Israel's ties to Africa. He came in 2016 and then he returned in 2017. And he met with, I think, over a dozen African leaders during those two visits and really deepened and expanded Israel's relations with so many of, particularly these West African countries, but not only. And then in 2021, Israel entered as an observer, as you mentioned, in the African Union. But everything started going south. I remember speaking to Dory Gold at the time when he was the Director General of the Foreign Ministry, and he said that the real bar to expanding Israel's ties with Africa the way that they should be is the South African government and Algeria, which are both deeply hostile to Israel. And then, so we had an observer status for the first time in 2021 under the previous government. And then in February, the Israeli delegation was sort of humiliatingly pushed out of the meeting in the summit in February. And that happened just 2 weeks after the president of Chad, what was his name, Mohammed Debi, came to Israel and opened up the Chadian embassy in Ramat Gan. So, you know, you have on the one hand, we had the relations with Chad, and we had Sudan entering the Abraham Accord and then sort of shifting away. We had the observer status in the AU, and then we're being pushed out. And so it feels like things are changing for the worse in Africa, and specifically in relation to its relations with Israel. Can you talk a little bit about these shifting sands?
Well, I think and I speak here, and I'll speak as a longtime friend and supporter of Israel. And as a friend, I'll speak candidly. Relations in Africa are built by constant cultivation and engagement. As you mentioned, going back to Golda Meir, Israel's engagement when it itself was still a developing nation in the wake of the War of Independence was extraordinary. The number of Israeli volunteers and experts who spread out across the newly in countries of Africa and built projects. And then, of course, after the Yom Kippur War, the retrenchment or falling back. Since the reopening after the Cold War, Israel has been more engaged. But I think that at times the resources are lacking for that engagement. For example, Israel development and cooperation extraordinary, but the amount of money allocated to Mashav for all of Africa is less than what would run a very modest program at the smallest U.S. embassy somewhere on the continent. Something your good sister, my good friend, would know a great deal about running U.S. aid. So, that's an example. Or not having embassies. Again, I recognize the challenges of a country and embassies stood up when there are 54 African countries. But still, some of the most important African countries, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, whose president, Felix Tshisekedi, made a historic state visit to Israel back in 2021, and even addressed a pro-Israel American organization, AIPAC, in 2020, and pledged to open an office in Jerusalem. And yet, years later, there's no Israeli embassy in Kinshasa, the capital of a country that has over 100 million people and all the natural resources we spoke about. So I would argue part of it has been pushed back, and you're right to identify South Africa and Algeria as problems. But I think also resources have to be found and priorities made in order to deepen the Israeli engagement on the continent.
And what about, aside from Israel, I mean, we just had, I think, a coup this week in Gabon, following one in Niger in late July. And then you wrote in a national interest article that just came out, I think it's that since 2020, those were the third and the fourth U.S. allied governments to fall after Mali and Burkina Faso, and that the government of Mohamed Bazoum in Niger was actually the last standing democratically elected government in Western Africa. So you're looking at what seems like a domino effect or something, that these pro-Western governments are falling, and Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were coming into all of these countries. So what is happening specifically inside of Africa? I certainly take your point that Israel is terrible at keeping focused on anything for longer than 30 seconds, but there are shifting sands inside of that area, specifically Western Africa, aren't there?
Well, in the Sahel, more specifically, where Niger was the last democratically elected government, but I think each of those coups has its own story and their backstories and particularities. So it's very, very dangerous to trends when you have unique factors that are specific to each one. That being said, it's not a good thing when you have multiple coups, or in some cases, for example, Burkina Faso, a coup following a coup. It's certainly not a sign of great progress. But I think we, the international community, also need to take a step back and recognize that just because a government was overthrown doesn't mean it was necessarily democratic. It may have been constitutional in the strictest legal sense, but not democratic. For example, in Guinea, which today, coincidentally, is the second anniversary coup there you had a president whose election in 2010, I still don't believe occurred, in the sense that mathematically, I don't see how that election, which was accepted by the international community, it was rigged. And his so-called re-election in 2015 was really disputed. And then he put it all off in 2020, that Alpha Conde arranged a so-called constitutional referendum to remove term limits so he could essentially stay on indefinitely. So when you weren't democratically elected to begin with, stayed in and don't allow people any chance to remove you peacefully, don't be surprised if they find another way to get rid of you. So not justifying coups. Now, the case of Niger is a particularly sad case, because a country where the first democratically elected president passing power to another democratically elected president peacefully. The country's had tremendous, with U.S., French, and other Western support, had tremendous strides in security. Earlier this year, it was the lowest level of violence that they've had in Niger from jihadists in 5 remarkable number of development goals made. So that was a democratically elected government. But we have to look behind it and what's happening. One is the old systems held. France, the former colonial power countries that have had coups, rather interesting history there. French colonies that have been having coups. Africa has weakened, and there's tremendous popular backlash against France. It's been kicked 2 countries in the last few years, and likely to be kicked out of a third, Niger. So the old colonial power is weakening. What I said about before, I could say equally, and I have to be honest enough to say about the United States. We always have not kept the eye on. Part of that is politics. For example, Niger, where there was the coup in July, we ironically, the day after the coup, we finally had the first Senate-confirmed ambassador for Niger in almost 2 years. So again, that's domestic American policy, but it has its impact on our foreign policy apparatus. And then finally, the other thing is we have to look at why these things are happening. Why is it that people greet these coups with, in some cases, jubilation and dancing in the streets? And it's because many of these governments are not legitimate in the eyes of their own people. They don't provide any services. They don't protect people against or very having their people against it. Now, not that the military men are any better. One of the reasons evoked for the coup in Burkina Faso that jihadists had managed to overrun a third of the country. So the military claimed that was the justification of the coup. They subsequently lost another third of the country. So not that they did any better. In fact, things worsened. So beware of looking for quick fixes, but understands what's happening behind it. And so we have to approach this pragmatically, but also realistically.
So what can, we realistically look at now? I mean, there are serious, as you said from the outset, there are serious strategic interests in Africa, whether it's the natural resources or the geography of it. I mean, you have Iran has been making inroads into Africa. China, of course, has been making inroads into Africa. And there's a lot to be gained by doing that. But then you have both, I guess, narrow bandwidth in terms of understanding it. And what is it that Iran or Russia, leave China aside for a second with their road and the Belt Initiative and what they've done. Let's leave that aside for a second. What are they offering these countries that, it would seem that the United States or Israel would be in a position to compete with Iran or with Russia for providing them with, so that we could secure interests and also help friends in that region succeed in governing their countries?
Well, yeah, I think you hit upon it, Caroline, when you say governance is the ultimate challenge here. It's governing vast territories with states that at independence were not that strong and didn't strengthen much over the years in many cases. And so it's a nation building process. It's something that I think Israel knows a great deal about. As Golda Meir was fond of telling her African interlocutors that Israel was like them, a developing country, seeking at that time in the 1950s, 60s, stand up on its own. So there's a lot to be learned from that example. Israel is a good example of successful state building, something that many Africans struggle with. So the governance part is very important. Now, what do malevolent actors like Iran or Russia, especially in the once Wagner's evolving right now after Prigozhin's demise, what do they offer? They offer many of these military juntas that seize power or governments that are weak. They offer a quick solution, now at a considerable price, but they offer a quick solution that very often our machinery in North America or in Europe or Israel is slow to take up on. Now, how did Wagner get into the Central African Republic? It was literally providing regime protection for their client, President Faustin Touadéra. For investment, they provided presidential security, and from there, they parlayed that into access to natural resources, which then before too long, they were helping with his re-election, and most recently helping him win a 95% approval rating farcical referendum, which eliminated his need to worry about term limits and how long each term was. So they provide a full suite of services. Now, I think it's on a very weak base, fragile, but it delivers quickly. And so that's one lesson to keep in mind. Two, they're pragmatic. Many of these regimes get cut off. A coup happens, terrible. But then U.S. law requires the cutting off of security assistance when these regimes are facing challenges. I'm not saying the law is wrong, but we have to find pragmatic ways to engage. In Mali, when there was a coup, when I was in the prior U.S. administration, we declared a coup. We stopped military, that's required under U.S. law, and seek a waiver. I didn't think that was politically wise. But we engaged with them. We kept channels of conversation open. I went to see the guy who led the coup. I cut off his military assistance, but I still went to see him 3 times, and we had actually a good dialogue. And in fact, as long as we were in office, Wagner was not on the scene. That dialogue kept it open. And glad in the recent Niger case thus far, despite offers by Prigozhin while he was still alive to come and help them, that they haven't crossed that line. And I think part of that has been the U.S. engagement. Acting Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland went and met with some of the members of the junta. The new U.S. Ambassador, Kathleen Fitzgibbon, flew into Niger and took the leadership of the U.S. Embassy. She hasn't presented credentials to, but at least we're engaging with them. So I think that pragmatic spirit, I think, goes a long way as well.
Okay. So they're giving these regimes the ability to stay in power. And you wrote in your national interest piece that, here you had Bazoum being subjected to a coup in July, and America has 1,000 forces in Niger, and the French have 1,500. And they didn't. And he asked for help from the French, and they didn't help him. So, this isn't sending a very good signal in terms of the steadfastness of support. Is this a one-time thing that a one-time test that they flunked in, or is this sort of also an issue?
Well, for the French, they're in an impossible dilemma. On one hand, social media, many of it driven by so-called troll farms linked back to Russia and Prigozhin, had for months been denigrating, delegitimizing President Bazoum in Niger. He actually openly complained about it in a speech 2 months before he was overthrown. No one provided any real help dealing with the social media campaign, which addressed the youth of the country more than half the nation. That's one. Two, they didn't turn to the U.S. for intervention, but they did turn to the French, and the French didn't provide it. Nor did they provide it in Gabon in the more recent coup, despite the fact that the Bongo family, which has been in power for most of the country's post-independence history, has been very closely French. So I think the French are in a difficult position. If they intervene, they're accused of intervening. And moreover, they weaken the person they intervene to help because he's being a French puppet. On the other hand, they don't intervene. They're accused of abandoning an ally. It's a very difficult position. I'm not sure it's a situation for them. But part of that they brought on themselves with the way they've conducted relations with many of these countries.
So I think that you're hitting on a significant problem that is larger than just one country or not, which is this. It's actually twofold. One is propaganda, like you were saying, that they're putting out these false statements about President Bazoum and just flooding the web with them in the weeks before the overthrow. And also there's this lack of this discomfort with power on the part of Western nations, with former colonialist nations, or the United States now with its, I don't know why they've assumed the mantle of post-imperialist guilt, because the United States wasn't really ever an empire, but all the same that, you have propaganda, which is enabling the Russians or the Chinese to be opposed to Western-aligned regimes in Africa. And on the other hand, you have the Western countries themselves who are unwilling to defend their friendship with these regimes or partnerships with these regimes when they come under criticism because of domestic sensitivities about their colonialist past or the denigration of the United States' role in the post-war period. So, I mean, you have this lack of balance that is working in favor of the Wagner groups and the Chinese. Is there a way to handle this? It's not only in Africa, obviously, that we see this playing out.
No, it isn't. But I think it is. We have a crisis of confidence in the West. Let's call it what it is, and we have to overcome that. Mentality applied to foreign policy, I think, undermines our interests. But we have to be realistic, and just like it took hundreds of years from Magna Carta to arrive at what became the constitutional settlement in the United States. It's not going to happen overnight. Many of these African countries are only for years post-independence. So I think we have to go about our expectations with that respect. And we also have to be engaged politically. And I think that's also important. We're seeking, for example, in many cases in the Sahel, strong anti-French set, but it doesn't necessarily translate into anti-Western or even, and certainly not anti-American. In France, for example, Niger had attacks on their embassy. The gate got burned down in one riot. The Nigerian government, or at least those of seized, are trying to expel the French ambassador. Right. They've repudiated 5 defense agreements with France and want the French troops gone. But at the same time, there has not been a single picket in the new U.S. embassy and no demands for the 1,000 U.S. personnel who are there assisting with intelligence operations and operations against jihadists, and not only in Niger, but really across the entire region. There's been no demand for them to leave. And I think we should take that as an opening. And there's no point in leaving in a huff and a puff just because the French are being pushed out. I think we have to be pragmatic about it.
All right, let's shift for a second to Israel. Aside from Israel not being so focused on what's happening in Africa, Africa is impacting Israel, and changes in African politics are changing its relationship with Israel. So, for instance, you have, I don't know whether you would call it a civil war. It's almost like a proxy war that's been going on for a number of years in Libya. And you have, and can you give me a sense of where things stand in Libya and how it plays into this meeting or ties between Libya and Israel? And I think the same speaks to Sudan, because, again, of the 4 Abraham Accords countries, Sudan is the only one that hasn't actually moved forward and formalized its relations. And now they're also enmeshed in a sort of a civil war and a major power struggle where it's actually the military leader who's the one who is pushing for normalization with Israel.
Well, so because it's emblematic of some of the challenges here. To be quite honest, I'm mystified by why, with all due respect, Foreign Minister Cohen prioritize building relations with Libya as opposed to spending the time on, if you will, lower route. I mean, Libya's government. Let me finish with Libya. Okay. Libya's government, for example, they can't even get. They operate with 2 parliaments. It controls just a strip of territory around its capital, and they are only because of massive assistance. Until last month, there were 2 rival central banks. And so even if there had been a breakthrough, it would have been a breakthrough with a phantom government that really didn't control anything. It couldn't deliver any real strategic benefit other than ticking a box and saying, oh, we got another government of sorts. So as opposed to, let's say, one could look at, working on restoring relations with Mauritania, for example, a country which had relations with until a number of years ago when the former president, in a populist move, those relations, or other places. So I really wonder about the Libya case, because it's an example, and I'm not singling out the foreign minister on this, but I think of countries in the West, and I include Israel obviously in that, who tend to look at Africa and look at the superficial surface rather than getting deep down. You get deep down into it, I really wonder why anyone would bother, other than the security issues for its neighbors, and the rest of Africa, Sahle, is victim to what came out of Libya after the death of Gaddafi. But why anyone would really bother with the make-believe government in Tripoli? And very often in Africa, we've got lots of make-believe. Another good example is, the so-called government in Somalia, which, barely controls its capital city, and a good chunk of which are unreformed jihadists.
So what would be a country that you think that you get more bang for your buck? And you were talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo being one of them, in Kinshasa, right?
One of them, where you've got a head of state who, for his own reasons, has a great affection for Israel, and that is literally at the heart of Africa, the center of the continent geographically, the center of the continent in as far as strategic minerals and resources and opportunities, and yet there's no Israeli embassy there. It's unimaginable.
We're going to put up the map, by the way, guys, because you really have to see the map to understand it all. I'm actually talking to you and looking at the map at the same time, but you're absolutely right. It's amazing that it's right there. It's right there.
100 million people, and one of the largest countries in Africa wants to embrace Israel, and there's no embassy there. That doesn't justify an embassy where it does.
Right. No, you're right. And so that's one aspect of it. And then the other one is what's happening in Sudan with the whole civil war, or whatever you want to call it, between the two warring factions.
And it's a mess, because to be quite honest, one could have an academic argument over which one is the greater threat. I mean, there's Burhan, the Sudan Armed Forces, the conventional military, which holds Khartoum, the capital, the urban centers along the Nile, and then there's despicable character, Hameti, the head of was once the Janjaweed militia, now the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary, which was created by the former dictator al-Bashir in order to balance out the military.
They were the ones who were killing all the Christians, right? And the animists.
They were killing the fellow Muslims. They were killing the Darfurs in the Darfur genocide back in 2004 and 5. They were allied with the government that was fighting the civil war against the South until the independence of South Sudan in 2011. But so you have two, and neither of them is a particularly clean actor, because at the time the Janjaweed, led by Hameti, were carrying out the genocide in Darfur, the military commander on the scene, who aided them but had plausible deniability, and I'll put plausible in quotation marks, was Burhan himself. So neither of them have clean hands into this. But they're equally matched forces, and it's unlikely that one or the other is going to prevail immediately. And that creates complications, to say the least.
To say the least. So the outlook for Sudan isn't great. And then when you look at these issues and you see, that I guess you could kind of say that the conflicting interests or goals of Western countries on the one hand, and then spoiler regimes like the Russians or the Iranians to a degree, is that the Western countries are more interested in political stability, and they're more interested in taking advantage of political instability. Would you agree with that characterization? And then, if so, it seems like they have an inherent advantage, because there's only one way, as one person would say to me, there's only one way to build an aircraft carrier, but there are a bazillion ways to take it apart, or there are so many pieces of it, and there's only one way to put it together in order to build an aircraft carrier. So here it's the same thing. If what you want is instability, if that's what makes you prosper, then you have a major advantage.
Well, I think there's truth in it, but I wouldn't say it's accurate in every sense.
Okay.
Because in some cases we push for we don't necessarily we say we want stability, but sometimes there are various kinds of stability. There's the short-term stability, which can be achieved various ways, and there's long-term. And what we need to do is hold our noses, go for short-term stability, and hope to bridge that into something long-term by engaging with them. We can't, and to achieve that short-term stability, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty, and sometimes you have to reach out and, grab hands that are not the cleanest in the world. And I think we have to be pragmatic. That's my point. We're in a generational struggle against malevolent forces, some ideological jihadists, the Iranian mullahs and their theocratic vision of the world, and some just simply out for profit. The Prigozhins, no longer him, but the Wagners of the world, mercenary groups, and malevolent actors, outside actors, and to a certain extent, China. And in many respects, we can't compete against someone if you're not there. And, we haven't spoken a lot about China, but China's great advantage.
Exactly where I wanted to move to, about China. I left it out until now because I wanted to talk about it specifically. So talk to me a little bit really about China and Africa and what it means also for the West.
Well, China, you can look at China's engagement with Africa in various stages. Certainly, it's been involved since the beginning of the post-colonial era with the Badong Conference and the non-aligned movement, and its support for a number of armed liberation movements in Africa. But then at the time of revolution, China turned inward and basically gave up the gains it was having and only returned in the 90s when it was a search for resources, access to resources. It's interesting, the first big deal that China had in Africa, its foot in the door, was actually Sudan taking over oil assets that had been abandoned by Western East because of the nature of the dictatorship in Sudan became too hot, too toxic for them. That gave China the opening. So it was a pursuit of resources, but it's become over time much more sophisticated. It's not just resources, at that time oil, or China's industrialization, modernization. It's been locking up supply. It's been very calculated, locking up supply chains, not just minerals it needs, but minerals to which to the global supply chain, and putting at risk and threatening a number of others, including the States and its partners. Also reaching out to China has the luxury, being an authoritarian state, to not be responsive to political conditions, or they can spend the people's money whichever way they want to spend it without having recourse, unlike democratic countries. That's an advantage. One has to acknowledge that. And up debt, they're happy to accept IOUs from African countries in the Belt and Road Initiative in exchange for future access to resources in a predatory lending. All that happens. But, to be fair to them, often the government sign these, so not because they want to, not because they don't know it's predatory. In some cases they'll, but in many cases because there's no alternative. There's no American loan program. It takes forever. And our other equally slow and sluggish. And, as I mentioned before, Mashab does a lot of great work in places it's present in Africa, but the budget is not even, it's, minuscule compared to, if you divide it by the number of countries that Israel has diplomatic relations with, Mashab's budget adds up to not even $1 million a country.
So here's the question, because we have about more or less 10 minutes left before you have to get going. So I want to try to round this out a little bit. If I'm trying to take the takeaway points from what you're saying, I would say in general that one of the most important things when you're looking at Africa is actually look at each country and try to figure out, A, what they can offer, and B, what they need, and use knowledge actually when you're pursuing your relations with those countries in order to advance their interests and advance America's interests or Israel's interests vis-a-vis that country. And that requires maybe professionals to be involved with this, and not just politicians who look at a map and say, oh, let's develop Africa, but actually having people or area experts who are able to go in and then look at each country specifically. You say each country has its own challenges, And then the other thing is just to have the staying power in order to maintain those ties over time, regardless, across the society. Is that basically what you're saying, that's sort of the way to go about looking at it?
I think those are two. I think those are two very important points that emphasize enough deep knowledge of the engagement over time, but also we have to be pragmatic, and that includes deals. No country ever grew out of poverty and became a developed country through aid programs. There helps along the way, but countries prosperous through innovation, through technology, through open markets, all the things that, the startup nation of Israel very well, and I don't need to give anyone lessons on that. And that includes engagement, business, encouraging business to go into Africa. That's important as well. So I think it's economic growth, because that also helps governments, our partners, deliver for their people. They've got Africa is the youngest continent on the planet. Got a huge demographic skew toward young people. The median age across the continent even 19. And so one thinks about that. Governments have to create jobs. They're under pressure to do so. And so economic growth, we have to engage them economically. And there's a lot there. Help them with value added. Like one of the, call out someone in the current U.S. administration, who I think is doing a fabulous job in this regard. And interestingly enough, it's not because he's in an Africa portfolio, but because he has a portfolio for infrastructure, energy. Thomas Hochstein, who helped negotiate the demarcation of the maritime border between Israel and Lebanon. And I was working on a number of projects to link Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia, three important countries, with infrastructure, but not just transport infrastructure, but communications infrastructure, energy, and help them toward doing value added. Why is value added important for their minerals? Because right now the minerals are shipped to China for processing. One, that's not very green. That allows China to have a stranglehold on global supply chains. Whereas if the value was done there, Africans could capture that wealth. Plus, they're less likely geopolitically to hold the resources up for hostage in the event of global tension. So it de-risks things for everyone. And let's be brutally frank, some of the processing is unlikely to happen. And we're in the United States, we have an issue with getting permitting for mining and much less for processing. So it's not like we're taking jobs that would exist given the vagaries of our bureaucracy.
But so, that leads me, I guess, to probably what's going to have to be my last question to you today, which is about values, because you mentioned Amos Hochstein, and I almost had a violent response to his name because the maritime deal that he delivered in the last government is a disaster for Israel. I mean, it's terrible. He pushed an interim government, I think 10 days before the election, to agree to surrender our economic waters and part of our territorial waters to a terrorist state that's controlled by Iran. And now they're working very hard to push that natural gas out of the Eastern Mediterranean area, now controlled by Lebanon, and that's just going to enrich our worst enemies. So I have a neuralgic response to that, but I think that it speaks to what I really wanted to ask you. As the last question is about values and about whether we're looking at this right. I just remember this conversation I think that I had with Ayaan Hirsi Ali many years ago, and she was saying that, when she was in Somalia and they were getting this international aid, that America would give this aid, food, whatever, with no strings attached. They would just throw down the aid from USAID and that was it. And that these Muslim countries, and I don't know whether she mentioned Iran at the time, but other ones, if not, were giving the aid and dawah in indoctrination into jihadist Islam, and that this was much more effective because not only were they giving them bread, but they were giving them meaning in their lives. And particularly if not going to be able to deliver tomorrow on economic promises, then providing people with belief system that's going to attach them to your cause or to your interests is significant. And so I don't know if you saw any of that in the Trump administration. Pragmatic approaches don't necessarily lend themselves to talking about, underlying issues of who we are and what it means to be on this planet.
Well, the argument I would make is that all of our countries have limits on our resources. We are not we don't have bottomless pockets, and so we owe it as democratic countries to our own taxpayers ultimately to get results consonant with their values, but at the same time with their interests for their money that we're spending. It's not our money; it's the people's money. I think that's an element that I think is missing often. Now, if we had all the resources in the world, infinite resources, that's one thing. But when we don't, we have to prioritize, and that's something I think the current U.S. administration perhaps is not very good at, prioritizing the interests of people and of their allies. And I think that's we could definitely improve on. And I think our values ultimately are what make things sustainable. My caveat to that would be, however, we have to think in long term. And sometimes the path to where you want to go isn't always the direct route. It's an indirect route. And we have to discern what that route is, lose sight of the objective, but we have to maintain, we can't be, so singularly minded that we lose out the long term by fighting little bad in the ultimately aren't that significant. So I think that goes back to the point about the importance of having specific knowledge. So you both have to have that long-term knowledge, those values, and an idea of where you're going to go, but you also have to have it in the short term and tactile.
So when you look at what's been going on in the Sahle area and these West African areas that have just been falling one by one, seemingly over the past 3 years, and you look at the general political outlook or position of the United States, and I would say equally of Israel in Africa and where it stands, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about what the future holds, especially when you're looking at China and Russia and other countries going in there?
Well, this is nudge, but I think it is important. I'm not trying to dodge it, but I would say it depends on we're at a tipping point, an inflection point, and it can go either way. And it's how I'll give you a very concrete example. I'll close on that. You mentioned the visit by Mohammed Idris Deby, the president of Chad, to Israel earlier this year. Chad is now a country surrounded every side. It literally has one way out. I mean, it's got a coup to its west, most recently in Niger. To the north, it has Libya, a totally failed state. To its east, it's got Sudan civil war. And in fact, Chad has taken in more refugees from the Sudan conflict in recent months than in fact, it's taken in an absolute majority of the rest that have fled Sudan. And then to its southeast, it's got the Central African Republic, a fully bought and held of the Wagner Group, and thus an extension of the Kremlin. And there's a state there in the middle that is imperfect in a transitional phase, that in its desire to draw closer to and the question is, what do we in the West, our European friends, and Israel do toward it? It's in a very bad neighborhood, and it could easily be the next for instability. What are we going to do concretely to ensure that this state that's surrounded, and just one anecdote in surrounding, I was just recently there. Ordinarily a flight from Paris to N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, is a 5.5-hour affair. But because of the instability all around and closures of airspace, it took me 10.5 hours to get there and about 9.5 to leave. because we had to fly circuitously around all of that. The only safe way out is through Nigeria. So gives you a graphic illustration of the stakes involved.
Well, I think that the stakes couldn't be higher, and I think given the reasons that you said at the outset of our conversation, and we have to be more focused on Africa because it just keeps coming out to bite us because apparently we understand far less than we do understand. So I appreciate you coming on the show this week and giving us a little bit of not only a bird's eye view, but, an overview of what's actually happening in the region and what the stakes are. And hopefully we can revisit this on specific issues in the future to try to both better understand Africa and better understand what we can do to help and be helped by Africa. So thank you very much for coming on the show this week.
Thank you for having me.
And it also seems as though, I just so you guys know, I originally reached out to Ambassador Pham, I think right after the coup in Niger, where it took me a little while to find you, to figure out what was happening there. And then between the time that I initially reached out to you and you were in West Africa and you came back, and today's conversation, we've had more coups in Gabon, and then we had the blow-ups with Libya and with Eritrea. So I think that understanding Africa and what's happening there and their relations with themselves and with the outside world is becoming very critical. So I thank you very much, Ambassador Pham, for coming on today. And guys, stay tuned next week. We're going to have a big show, 30 years to the Oslo disaster. So stay on this wavelength, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you so much, Ambassador Pham.
Thank you.
Take care.